Hey peeps, today I'm talking all things piping. Some applications of piping will need to go all the way around in a circle, and you need to know how to finish that off so that you end up with a neat and unobtrusive finish. So let's have a look and see how I did that. One of the places that I've decided to add piping is to my cuff, so I've altered the pattern accordingly. This is adding piping continuously or in the round, so I'm going to show you how I've achieved this. This cuff has obviously got an opening so that it can be sewn to the bottom of the sleeve when that's ready, but we want to get to this point first. So I have got my interfaced cuff, I've got my piping, I've got the ruler loop that I'm going to use for the button loops, and then I have the uninterfaced cuff piece which I have pressed under the top edge by 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to take these away to begin with. I will also need a marking tool, and I'm using my seam gauge because that's an easy way of measuring 5/8 of an inch, which is the seam allowance that I'm working with. I've got my piping falling off of the board that it's currently on, but I want to unroll a decent chunk, and again I'm putting the board in my lap. I want to have the piping in a bottom, or the overlap of my piping in sort of the bottom corner, and I'm going to make sure that when I put on my rouleau loops it's in such a position that this ends up, when the cuff is buttoned up, that it's on the overlap like that. So I want the join to be on the bottom side, and I want it to be kind of towards the back of the cuff. I'm going to start this one with the piping in the bottom corner like this, because with the other one I started it in this end, and I want to leave myself a 1.5 inch flap of the piping free. So I'm going to start stitching and I'm going to back stitch there. I'm going to mark on the position of the corner, so if I very carefully pin this into place, what I'm going to do is take my seam gauge and I'm going to measure 5/8 of an inch away from the short edge of the cuff and just make a little mark there, and that's going to be my pivot point. I'm going to do that at each stage as I sew this down. I'm not going to pin this into place because I find it harder to work with things when they're pinned into place, and you can see here that pinning it has actually put a bubble in it, so it kind of, for me, makes it slightly less accurate. So as I say, I'm going to start sewing about 1.5 inches away from the end and leave that flapping free to start with. I'm going to back stitch at the beginning. I'm going to sew to the 5/8 of an inch pivot point, which means that my piping then needs to go around the corner. I'm going to leave my needle down in that pivot point and clip into the flange of the piping so that I can easily turn this around the corner, and you will end up with a little bump in your piping. I'll get that started under the presser foot and I'll move the camera so that I can hopefully show you how I deal with that little bump and how we go around the corners. But the important thing to note here is that we are leaving 1.5 inches free and back stitching right there. And again, we are using our zipper foot and we are sewing as close to and on top of the previous line of stitching that secured the piping cording into the fabric. I have hit the point, or I'm just a tiny little bit in front of the pivot point that I have marked. I've left my needle down and I have hovered my foot and I have clipped into the seam allowance. So I'm now going to hover the foot again and spin the cording around, and because of the preparation we did for the piping earlier, we know that our piping flange is the same width as our seam allowance, so I am getting the raw edge of the fabric of the piping to match up with the raw edge of the fabric of the cuff. So we've got a little gather in the piping there where there's more cord going inside of a curve. When we turn this around, it's going to go nicely around the curve or the corner, but for now there is a little bit of excess fabric there, so you want to just be careful when you're stitching your corner that you don't stitch into the cording of the piping itself. So I'm going to take a couple of stitches on the diagonal and then move everything around again and stitch towards the next pivot point. I'm going to take my seam gauge and again 5/8 of an inch, just make a little mark with my friction pen and continue sewing up until this second point. You can, if it's easier, clip into your piping ahead of time. You want to clip up to, but not quite right up to the pivot point. I'm going to keep going. Okay, so I've hit the next pivot point. So again, the needle is going to stay down. I'm going to hover the foot and maneuver my piping around the corner, and again there is slightly too much cording for that corner because we want it to sit nicely when it's turned the other way. So carry on stitching, and again matching up the raw edge of the piping with the raw edge of the cuff. Okay, so again coming up to that corner, 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge, making a mark, clip into and up to that mark, because you don't want to clip the cuff as yet. We're going to trim off the excess later, but at the moment you want to leave the cuff intact. So up to that mark, raise the presser foot, keep the needle down, move the piping around the corner. Okay, same thing, final corner that we have to pivot around. Final corner. Okay, so I'm going to cut off myself a very long tail that overlaps the previous start of the piping by quite a lot, which is just out of shot for you. So let's get a little closer. There we go. So yeah, I've cut off a tail from my piping that is as long, goes to the second short edge. So we've got two very long pieces of piping floating free there. So I'm going to stitch and then back stitch and take the work out from under the presser foot, and I can back you off a little bit. So I'm going to trim off my thread tails because we don't need those. So you can see here there's a couple of inches between the starting and stopping point of the piping. Don't worry if it's not sitting completely flat around the corners. You can always just clip into the flange of the piping a little more just to release a little bit more of that tension. Obviously don't clip into your stitching, but when you turn this around you'll see that it's not bunching up at the corner anymore because there's enough of the cording to go around the corner. So we need to finish this off, and we want to do it in such a way that it overlaps and there's no raw edges. So I'm just going to trim off the little bit of excess cording that's poking out the end there. And if I lay these on top of each other, you can see where they come to. So where this longer piece comes to. So I'm just going to make a tiny mark on the piping at the end of the cording underneath, and then I am going to unpick the flange or the stitching that secures the cording into place from that mark backwards to the raw edge. And this is far too, you know, this is much longer than we actually need it, but we need to trim off the excess cording that is inside of this part of the fabric. This is why when we sewed the piping together we did it with a slightly longer stitch, because it makes unpicking this section much easier. So I've taken off the top level of thread, just going to take off the bobbin thread or the thread underneath, and we can see that I've now got the fabric of the piping open to match up to the point where the original piping finishes. So I'm going to peel this back, and I want to cut off the cording only from the piece of piping that was laying over the top. So I've cut all that off, and so now the two pieces of cording are going to match up and butt up against each other. So the next thing that we need to do is make ourselves a nice neat finished edge. Now we don't need this much fabric, but we do want a decent chunk of fabric to play around with, so I've cut like an inch of the excess off there. What we're going to do now is we are going to fold this back on itself and make sure that the edges are nice and neat, and then we're going to nest the original piece of piping in between. So it should end up looking something like that. You don't want to pull on anything. You want to make sure that everything is lying nice and flatly. We don't want there to be any excess of the pink fabric poking up this way. Once you're happy with the position of that, you want to take it back to the sewing machine, and backstitching at the beginning and end, just secure that last remainder of the piping into place. Cut off the thread tails. And there you go. You can see on the back we've closed up that small piece that we left open. There is a bit of a jog there because there is a little excess fabric in there, so it's made it slightly bulkier, but that is, in my opinion, a really nice neat join. So the next thing that we need to do is add on our rouleau loops to make this into a functioning cuff that will work with the buttons that we're going to put on later. I personally prefer my rouleau loops to be underneath of the piping. You can have them on top of the piping, and if you would rather have them on top of the piping, you put them on first and then do this stage, the piping stage. But like I say, I prefer mine to sit underneath of my piping. I think it looks neater. So I am going to attach my 4 rouleau loops, and this is just a tutorial on how to put the piping together. If you want to see how I make the rouleau loops and attach them and the spacing for them for this particular pattern, which is the Vogue 9076, there is a full sew along which I will link to up here and in the description down below. So I'm going to get the rouleau loops in place, and then I'll show you the next stage to finish off the cuff. Okay, so I have put the rouleau loops onto the cuff, and I have tacked them into place at the edge and then also very close to the piping so that they don't move around when they're being stitched into place. Now I want to line up my undercuff with my overcuff pre-prepared cuff. I have, as you saw, pre-pressed the fold, the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance under. So I do want to sew this from this side because I want to be able to go over the line of stitching that you can see here. So I'm going to pin this into place, and this time I will be pinning. And it's more that I'm pinning it into place so that things sit neatly and don't get pulled out of alignment, because it's easy to stretch out the fabric that's not been interfaced, and we don't want to do that. We don't want to have any puckers in the undercuff. It wouldn't be the end of the world. You could get away with it because it is the undercuff, but ideally you don't want any puckers there. So just matching up the raw edges and pinning that all into place. And the other thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we are pinning the undercuff with the seam allowance upwards. So although we've pressed it under, that's just so that it's easier to sew it into place later. We want to make sure that we are not sewing that seam allowance down in the pressed position. So there's that one. We just finish this side. So I'm matching up all the raw edges and pinning this into place. So now that's all pinned, like I say, we are going to be sewing over the previous line of stitching, and you're going to want to start from the pressed edge of your cuff, and you're going to backstitch that corner and sew all the way around. Now again, bear in mind that there is excess cording at the corners, so you're going to want to be careful and kind of try and maneuver and push that cording underneath and into the center of the cuff so that you don't catch it in the needle when you're sewing. So you can see I have sewn on top of the previous line of stitching, and I have kind of, rather than try and do a sharp corner, I have done a couple of diagonal stitches around the corner to really make sure that that piping is being pushed in. This piece here, there's a slight difference between the two lines of stitching which might show on the piping. So before I trim anything, I'm going to turn this through and just see if it's too far away from the piping for my liking, but with pressing I think that's actually going to be okay. So what I'm going to do now is trim off all of the excess from the corners the same way we would do with a regular cuff, and then again trimming off the excess there, same with the other corner, and take off the bulk of the seam from the bottom and just trim off that area there. So we've trimmed off quite a lot of the bulk from the cuff, and now we get to turn it through. So these aren't going to be sharp corners, they're going to be curved corners, but we do want them to look as nice as possible, and I'm really pleased with that. And as you can see, I have if I can get them into focus, there we go. As you can see, I've got a mirrored pair, so when they get attached to the sleeves they will obviously be opposites of each other, not identical. You don't want to have identical cuffs, but you can see here that's the join for the cuff that we've just done, that's the join on the cuff that we've originally done, and the loops are on the other end. So I'm just going to go and give this a press, and I like to press it really gently from the top side first, and I'm going to press it in such a way that I am just overlapping the piping ever so slightly, because there are some places where you can see the stitching of the piping. So one of the nice things about this is you can press it in such a way that that slight excess of fabric gets pressed over it, and then you won't see that stitching unless you are very, very, very close. I'm also going to press my rouleau loops and nice and flat, because again that's my preference. So I'll give that a press, and then we have made our cuffs. Again, there are lots of different ways of doing this. I'm not saying that I'm an expert, and I'm not saying this is the only way to do any of these techniques, but these are the ways that have worked best for me, and I really like the results that I've got from this particular finish. I have one large video of all of the mini tutorials back to back, so hopefully I have covered what you're looking for in that. I will link to the playlist and all of the individual videos in the description down below. But if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section down below, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.